and that our natural environment, specifically in Scotland, is not adapted to the climate of southern Europe. So that could mean significant changes how we use the land and also manage our water supply. And also the effect on the more southerly countries will also affect us in trade and relations. So that's quite important as well. But specifically the need to change how we use the land and manage our water resources, that's something I won't go into greater detail. So whilst there are lots of uncertainty, we're fairly confident about increased temperatures, lower growing seasons, longer growing seasons. We're less certain about rainfall-related changes, reasonably confident about soil moisture deficits, that they will increase, specifically in the east of Scotland, but we're much less certain about winds and strong winds, and so on and so forth. For agriculture, there are risks, challenges, but also opportunities. I've already mentioned water management. That will be increasingly relevant. I think in Scotland we're not really used to the notion of water shortages because we always seem to have too much of it. But water management, both in terms of the quality but also quantity, flooding-related events will become more important. There will be new diseases, new pests, and this is something that farmers already pick up on the ground, and they have already are already adapting their management to take account of that. But on the plus side, there might be a wider range of crops that we could be growing in a longer growing season. There might also be more prime agriculture land, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But most importantly, we will have to use agricultural land to meet other societal objectives. And the most obvious link here is sustainable flood management. And there are decisions to be taken in the future about linking areas up and not just focusing on one area, but actually linking up land uses. This is a slide that has been given to me by the Macaulay Institute, by the Soils Group, who has been looking into the land classification in Scotland. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is the prime agricultural land as classified between 1961 and 1980. And it is quite obvious, I think, that we have only a very small amount of prime agricultural land in Scotland, which gives us very little flexibility in terms of agricultural production. But we have already seen in reclassifying the land that already recent climate change has impacted on the amount of prime agricultural land that is available now. So there have already been changes taking place up to now. And if you were to look ahead and see what might be happening between now and 2050 under a medium-high scenario, we can see that we have potentially large gains in prime agricultural land. And that is something that we really need to look into in much greater detail. These slides have been given to me with the proviso. This is just preliminary work. It needs to be refined, taking into account more parameters. But it is really quite relevant to see that potentially we have large gains in prime agricultural land as a direct effect of a changing climate. But also on the downside, we see that probably we have increased risk of water deficits during the growing season. So this is a map that shows the orange and red areas which are currently already affected by soil moisture deficits. But then looking at indicator crops and future scenarios, we can see that these areas are likely to be increasing significantly. So, and it is specifically on the East Coast where we also are likely to see the most gains in prime agricultural land. So that is quite important for us to consider when we plan ahead to the future. Just want to pause just at the background of with these slides, talking a bit about the land use strategy. because we know that in future there will be more competing pressures on the small amount of resource that we have in Scotland. There is the agricultural land use, we need to produce food, a large amount of land is being used for livestock production, but at the same time we have challenging woodland afforestation targets, so where should those new woodlands go? We have the recreation and sporting interest, so the large shooting stage, so they're not necessarily keen to either have a large amount of their land being afforested, or neither would they be happy to have large wind farms located within their land. Increasingly, land will need to be used for development. The Aberdeen City Bypass is directly located in a pocket of prime agricultural land. There's other development that needs to take place, and usually the pressure is on the land in those areas which are actually prime agricultural land. Increasingly, we're thinking about restoring peatlands. Those are again located in the areas in the uplands, which might also be used for shooting estates and also afforestation, but also wind farms. There are lots of increasing pressures, and on top of that, we want to reserve and identify land to use in sustainable flood management, and actually identify areas which we might at times sacrifice for flooding. So, and that's why the land use strategy has been put in place. It is actually a statutory requirement of the Scottish Climate Change Act, and the first strategy has been published just recently. It will need to be revised in 5 years' time, but it is a first step to achieve a more integrated approach to land use, maintaining the future capacity of Scotland's land, and in the future it will be a good tool to help us to actually mop up the impact of a changing climate in Scotland. I'll wrap up. Just briefly want to talk about the challenges. I won't go into the details on the greenhouse gas inventory, but just very briefly highlight that the use of evidence in dealing with uncertainty in policy and delivery is quite a challenge. But also, more importantly, how do you reach those you want to influence? And I'm sure that Rebecca will be saying a bit more about it. Influencing behavioural change in a subsidised industry that agriculture is a particular challenge. And I just want you to look here at the policy cycle. It is a sort of bread and butter of every civil servant. The various stages we need to go through in initiating, planning and delivering policy. And we're very good at that. We're very good at shaping policy. But in the very heart of that cycle, you see there is the research evidence, and there is the engagement with customers and stakeholders. And I think that particularly in the engagement with customers and stakeholders and the delivery side, Scottish Government perhaps increasingly now is spending more time on. In terms of evidence, you can have very good, solid evidence with almost no uncertainty. But if you're not getting through to your main customers who want to influence, they will largely ignore it. So you really need to think about how you bring those messages across. If you have weak evidence, like we have in agriculture and climate change, where there's large uncertainty associated with emission and mitigation figures, on the contrary, customers will throw that back to you and say, how can you actually require us to take specific action when you don't really have the evidence? So with evidence, you can never really get it completely right. But what we can try to focus on more specifically is actually how we tailor our messages and how we affect behaviour change. And I can almost see that with social researchers in Scottish Government, we need to come up with a behaviour change cycle. How do we actually identify the stakeholders? How do we do it as the next step, stakeholder segmentation, tailor our messages specifically to those, and come up with various mechanisms to bring our messages across. but I'm sure that today there will be a bit more about that. So my final thought is just really